Just over 10 years ago, Scott Pilgrim was one of the biggest series in comics, but does it hold up today? Woof woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another review. I've been wanting to do a review on the Scott Pilgrim series for quite a bit of time now, ever since he announced that they're going to re-release the game. For those of you who don't know, Scott Pilgrim was created, written and illustrated by a guy called Brian Lee O'Malley, and it originally came out in 6 black and white volumes that were a similar trim size to manga, whatever that is, and then years later it was re-released in full colour. The first volume was published by Oni Press on August 18th, 2004, and the last volume came out in July 20th, 2010. During the time when it was being published, it received many awards, he even got an Eisner, and he also got a movie adaptation that came out pretty shortly after the last volume was released. And if you weren't really reading comics at the time when this was originally coming out, this was one of the most talked about series. It was pretty much the equivalent to Harry Potter in comics. And I genuinely think the series is responsible in having a helping hand as to why manga's been allowed to become popular over here. But considering that it was only just over a decade ago that the last volume came out, you don't really hear too many people talking about it anymore. But now that I'm older, now that I'm pretty much just older, I'm not wiser or anything like that, I wanted to go back and sit down with the series again and see if it still holds up today. And to do that, we're going to look at the plot, the art, we've got a spoiler-free section, we've got a spoiler discussion, all before my final verdict. But if you've watched any of my reviews before, you know we can't do that before we do the too long didn't watch. This is my TLDW, it's a part of the video for people who maybe don't want to watch the full thing, but you still want to know if this is a book that maybe you should pick up. And this has been the first time that it's been difficult to do one of these when I'm talking about Scott Pilgrim, because I think where you are at in your life depends on the story that you get. Say for example you're someone who's new to the dating scene, or maybe you don't have that much experience, you're going to get a really fun romance story that's got a quirky sense of humour and great Dragon Ball Z style fights. But maybe if you're someone who's experienced more of life, you're going to get a really reflective tale about the mistakes that we make as we're growing up and how fleeting the relationships that we have with the people around us can actually be. I know that was vague as anything, but anybody who's read the series will probably agree with me on that, and if that's all the review that you needed, I hope you enjoyed it. Please give this video a thumbs up. If you're new here, make sure you click that subscribe button and get your paws all over that bell notification so that you can become part of the Dog Pound and make sure that you never miss out on a video. And do you boy a favour, because I really need it right now, if you could share this video on your Facebook, your Instagram, your Twitter page, maybe on a Reddit, maybe just send it to your mom, see if she was reading Scott Pilgrim at the time that it came out, that would really help the channel. But if you're looking for a bit more of a thorough review, let's just start with the plot. Scott Pilgrim's a 23-year-old and he finds himself in that part of his life where you're not really a child anymore, but you're not really fully mature as an adult. So he's got no job and he still sleeps in the same bed as his gay roommate Wallace. With that, you'd think that Scott would be feeling quite down in the dumps, but between his band Sex with Bomb and the fact that he's just started dating a 17-year-old high school student called Knives Chow, he's feeling pretty awesome. And I'm not calling him awesome, that's the rating that he's given himself. However, because he hasn't got too much responsibility, the only thing that seems to get him out of bed in the morning is a recurring dream that he has with a rollerblading delivery woman. This is Ramona Flowers, and when Scott realises that she's real, he will do anything that he can to ensure that he can be with it. But besides the fact that Scott can't seem to break up with the infatuated Knives, the biggest hurdle is still yet to come, and that is Ramona's 7 evil exes. Will Scott be able to emerge victorious over the relationships that have failed so that his can succeed? What if Scott's doomed to make the same mistakes that he's made in the past in this relationship with Ramona? And what if after all this fighting, his relationship with Ramona is never meant to be? It's weird talking about the art in Scott Pilgrim, and I didn't think that there'd be too much to say, but it's deceptively simple. You know, you always hear people talk about the style of Scott Pilgrim and the fact that it does incorporate a lot of video game stuff, and that's what makes it really interesting. But for me, if you look at the actual detail or knowing when to use detail, that was what really stood out for me when I was rereading it. Like, it's clear that there's a Japanese manga influence that's going on, and normally I don't like reading into the background of a book before I do a review of it, because I feel like sometimes it can taint my perspective if I know that they've put a ton of work into something, and maybe if I didn't enjoy it, sometimes I can go, well, I'll give them more credit than it probably deserved at the time I was reading it. But I did look into the history of Scott Pilgrim, and it's actually quite interesting that Brian Lee O'Malley hadn't read too much manga before he started doing this series, but still naturally got that style. And I love the way that Brian Lee O'Malley knows how exactly to frame a scene, because he hasn't got that constraint of doing a 22-page issue and knowing that it's got to all fit within those 22 pages. He was allowed to use it more to his advantage. So you've got scenes where, you know, there's there's multiple panels where there's not a lot happening, but there's just subtle changes between each one. And with the fights, he can just use splash pages for near enough every single punch because of the fact that he isn't constrained to anything. And I really like that, especially for a book that's small in size. Like, you're never really going to see an absolute of Scott Pilgrim or anything like that. I love that he knew exactly when to open the page up for the audience. But when I originally got the colour editions, I didn't know whether it was going to be worth doing a video on if it's better to read it in colour or black and white. I'm just going to touch on it here. If you want a more in-depth video, just let me know in the comments below. I don't really know if anyone's interested in that, but for me, I actually feel like colour made it a completely different story. What I liked about the original is that it felt a bit rough around the edges. It felt like somebody was just sketching and you were getting it as soon as it was done. But with the colour edition, even though it did add new detail and different layers to the storyline, it was nice knowing what colour Ramona's hair was when they were referring to it. I felt like the story became too clean, and I felt like it lost a bit of the identity that it gained when it was originally coming out in black and white. That's not to say that the colour editions are bad. Like, you do get something new with the colour, but I just think you lose a little bit of that raw aspect that came in the original editions. And with the colour editions, I don't know if this is just me being an idiot, but I didn't actually notice when it was flashing back and when it was in present day sometimes, because it could switch between pages. It took me longer than I was willing to admit that if the page backing is in black, then that's a flashback, but if it's in white, it's present day. Whereas I don't remember having that issue when I was reading it in black and white, and I don't really know how colour can make it less obvious that it's a flashback or not. But maybe it was the fact that when I was reading it in black and white, I had to pay more attention to detail because of the fact that it wasn't colour coordinated. But overall, I do think this art style is really interesting. I'm looking forward to reading some of his other books and seeing how that evolved. I didn't even know that in the last volume, there's actually 2 extra people that worked on the book and they just did the backgrounds. And I think that's what I mean when I say it's deceptively simple, because of the fact that I never really knew that until after the fact when I read about it. But for something like Scott Pilgrim that I think is trying to be accessible to as many people as possible, I think a style like this really works well. I don't really think it's going to be one of my favourite styles of all time, but at the same time, I did really enjoy it as I was reading it. We're getting into the spoiler-free section now, and I think this review is going to be different than ones that I've done before. Because of the fact that it's such a long series and so much goes on with it, I'm just going to touch on some of the main points. I'm not going to cover absolutely everything, else we'd be here for about 4 hours. So a lot of my stuff isn't scripted, I've just got some bullet points, so hopefully it's not too waffly or anything like that. But when this was originally coming out and I was reading it then, and I was waiting for those volumes to come out like once a year, I actually found myself not relating to too much, and I didn't realise it at the time, but I just really enjoyed the action as it was happening. And I like this kind of like mystical, fantasy-like quest that's set in this real world of Canada. But now I didn't really find myself being blown away with the kind of video game elements to it, but I really found myself relating to the characters, and I could see myself in other characters at different points throughout my own life. Although there was one character that I never really related to, because I've never been the Envy Adams of anyone's story. I'm normally always the Knives Chow. One thing that I will say without spoiling anything is that the ending was disappointed for me. Obviously we are going to go on about it more as we get into the spoiler section, but I just felt like it focused too much on a final boss battle rather than the characters that we've grown to love throughout the books that had come before. And I remember when this was coming out, it was an absolute must read. Like the day when that last volume came out, it got delivered from Amazon, damaged a little bit, yeah, let's be honest, but I remember getting it, opening it, and pretty much sitting by the front door and just reading it as soon as I could. But this time as I was reading it, it was never a chore or anything like that, but it never had that effect where I couldn't put it down. Yeah, you can probably chalk that up to the fact that I have already read it before and I knew exactly where the characters were going to go, but I've read stuff like Ultimate Spider-Man more than once, I've read Green Lantern by Jeff Johns, I've read Invincible more than once, and even though I already know what's happening in those stories, they still have that addicting factor to it, which just wasn't here when I was revisiting Scott Pilgrim. The passage of time's quite weird with this story as well. I often thought that I'd skipped pages, but I hadn't. It was just the fact that it changed scene before it actually felt like the previous scene was finished. And sometimes there'd be a moment where there's quite a bit of suspense or tension, and then all of a sudden I'm in a bathroom just watching Knives dye her hair. This wasn't to the point where it completely threw you off the story, but on the instances where it happened, it did kind of make the pace feel like it was at a frenzy that it didn't need to be, and you were kind of just like, okay then. However, one thing that worked really well now that we've got the luxury of not needing to wait for the next volume is how it illustrated Scott's flaws without it ever really rubbing it in your face. When you first meet Scott, he is this quirky, charming, charismatic character that you feel can't really do any wrong, but as the story goes on, they put him in situations where you are forced to ask yourself if this is really a good character at all. And it's never to the point where you dislike Scott, you just question why exactly you want him to get the thing that he does, because it does make you question his goals and if he's even doing doing it for the right reason. And it just opened the door for some really good character development, because now that I'm older and I'm not the 23 years old that Scott is, you can reflect on it and see parts of yourself in the characters. And with quite a lot of characters who do make mistakes, but not for the sole purpose of you disliking the character and wanting them to fail in the book, but because that's just how humans are. That character development, along with how well the balancing of styles works, is the most impressive thing about Scott Pilgrim. Like I said at the beginning, this came out at a time when manga wasn't particularly big, so it was taking a massive risk by just having this style that we as Western audiences hadn't ever really seen before. And what I liked is how well it balanced those different styles. So you've got the fights that are pretty much like a Dragon Ball Z manga, and then you've got kind of like indie storytelling when you've got the character moments, and then you've also just got like video game iconography, but at no point does it feel like it doesn't belong. Speaking of which, the fights were really cool, and like I said when I was first reading Scott Pilgrim, this is what I loved these books for. Reading it now with the hindsight of who all the X's are in advance, you can see that each one brought something different to the table. And yeah, I did just complain about the pacing, but I liked how jarring these fights could be, because you could have two characters that are having like a really deep personal conversation, then all of a sudden someone who looks like they're from the Matrix with a samurai sword will just force a character into a fight. As well, I think this series should be commended on how well it handles all these different characters and different personalities. Yeah, I felt like the last book didn't really give them the time or attention that they deserved, but for the 5 books that came before that, they all brought something different to the table. My personal favourites were Stacy, Wallace, Stephen and young Neil. And even if a character hadn't shown up for a while, or maybe they'd just been in a few pages, you still always remembered who they are. People like Julie or Camus, or even a character like Lisa, who first appeared in a flashback before she even properly was introduced in the book. But I did just find myself wishing that the focus hadn't been pulled away from them so much when it got into those later books. Well, I think that's why the last book felt a bit disappointing, and if you're somebody like me and you fall in love more with the side characters than you do the main characters, you might be in the same boat. I know there's some people who do love this ending, and that's fine, everybody's going to have a different reading of it, but for me, that last book didn't really stick the landing that the first 5 books had done before. Although I can't really say too much more without jumping into spoilers, so we're just going to jump into that now. This is your final spoiler warning. If you haven't read this series before and you don't want anything ruined, I'd recommend checking out the timestamps below and jumping to the final verdict. One thing that really stood out for me when I read it through this time was when Stephen Stills came out as being gay and they didn't make a big deal about it. I just thought that was the perfect way to handle that. Because when I first read this, I didn't have my best friend that I've got now, but she told me that she was a lesbian, and it was pretty much the same deal, that she just told me it didn't really matter and we just moved on with our lives as friends. Like, I knew some people took issue with the way that Wallace was presented and the fact that people use gay slurs and stuff like that towards characters. I never really picked up on it, but at the same time, I'm not part of that community, so maybe it's not something that would bother me in particular. There was some stuff with the 4th X, and obviously Scott wasn't aware that she'd ever dated a girl before, that Ramona had been bisexual, but I liked the way that every other character within the book was just fine with it, and it wasn't a massive deal, it was just another X that Scott had to defeat. But in this spoiler section, I really wanted to develop my thoughts about the 5 main women throughout the book, because on my first reading it was all about the 7 evil X's and obviously focusing on Ramona's relationships because that's where the majority of the fights came from, but on this reading it was more about Scott's relationships and how they developed him, and how each of the women throughout his life represented something different. Starting off with Envy, because for me she was to Scott what Scott is to Knives. That one who got away, and Scott constantly tortures himself with the thought that if he'd done something different, or maybe if he'd changed something about him, he could still be with Envy. Like, it's played up as a joke, but the part where Ramona tells Scott that he needs a haircut and it reminds him of the fact that the last time that he got a haircut was just before Envy dumped him, it just kind of rationalises that train of thought that he's got. And then obviously you've got those similarities with Knives, because she thinks that if she just dyes her hair she can win Scott back. I'm going to come back to this train of thought a little bit later to hopefully tie my point together, but the next one that I want to talk about is Kim. She's the one who got away and they never had a chance to properly have a relationship, and you can tell that in the back of both their heads they are wondering if they would have been right for each other. Sure, sometimes they do tell themselves that they aren't, but you can tell that the fact that they're even asking the question and denying it is fact that they're still thinking about it and considering it. Knives is Scott's opportunity to learn that he was never the perfect boyfriend, and he is pretty much the equivalent to Knives as what Envy was to him. So he makes those same mistakes, he doesn't really show her the respect, he doesn't really treat her with the love that she deserves. In the same way that Scott was trying to be the perfect boyfriend for Envy, Knives tries to be the perfect girlfriend for Scott when she was never going to be. Then you've got Lisa, and although the main time with her is confined to the 1 volume, she is the temptation that helps Scott realise what what it is that he truly wants. And then finally you've got Ramona, and she is presented as the right girl for Scott, and then Scott gets the chance to realise that no relationship is perfect and all you can do is aim for that but know that you can never obtain it, and Ramona is a girl that he wants to work towards that with. So the evil exes that originally entertained me throughout this series when I was first reading it didn't really have as much of an impact on me now because of the fact that I was focusing more on Scott's relationships rather than Ramona's previous ones. Just to touch on those exes though, I really liked how Gideon was built up throughout the books so that he really felt like a big final boss towards the end. But my favourite ex is Lucas Lee, and I find that he's quite different from his movie character part, but at the same time my favourite ex within the movie was Lucas Lee, and I like that rather than just having another fight, he actually had a race with Todd different to what was shown in the movie. This part of the book made me wish that I knew more about Canada so that I understood the shop that they're talking about and if it's as chaotic as they play it up to be. One thing that did really disappoint me though, because I felt like the build up for Gideon was so good, was the fact that the glow didn't really ever pay off for me. I finished reading this last week and I can't even tell you what the glow was about anymore. I was cool with the whole subspace highways, but the glow was just a mystery box concept in my opinion. But to move on to the ending, I remember just shortly after the last book came out, iFanboy were talking about it and they all said that they wished that Scott had ended up with knives, and I never really understood why. When I first read this, I wanted Scott to end up with Envy because I feel like that would have completed the arc that Scott was going through and he would have had the chance to redeem himself in the relationship that he hasn't really seemed able to move on from. And I think if this is a story about Scott realising what it really means to be an adult and going through that coming of age type tale, that would have made the most sense, because do you remember when you have your first non-high school relationship and you make absolutely every stupid mistake? You make so many dumb decisions because you convince yourself that this has to work, because it's the first time that you've ever felt like you've loved somebody and you'd do anything to not lose that. But then when you get some distance, you manage to ask yourself if the effort that you are putting in is worth it for the relationship that you got. So I thought it was going to go down the route that Scott realised that the fight that he's having for Ramona is more about him trying to avoid the issues that he's got with himself, which is what I originally thought the Nega Scott was representing, and he was going to realise that the fight that he's had with these 7 evil exes was just so that he didn't have to confront the issues with himself. I thought that that was going to give him the chance to learn from those mistakes. So if he would have ended up with Envy, he could have finally corrected the thing that he's been holding over himself and he hasn't been able to improve from, as a result of having a very messy, chaotic and kind of toxic relationship with Ramona. However, this time reading it, I still didn't want him to end up with Ramona. I wanted the lesson to be that when you're younger and you think that you're invincible, as evident in all these fights that he goes through without even a second thought about it, you have this idea that it's us against the world and you think it's romantic and you think it's perfect. That's actually quite a toxic mindset to have, because of the fact that there's always going to have to be something to fight in order for that relationship to succeed. I wanted him to learn that you can fight for the wrong thing or you could fight for the wrong person. That sometimes you can only want to be with someone because of the effort that you've gone through, because of the struggle that there's been so far, not because that person's right for you. That's one of the hardest things that you can learn and have to accept as you're going through relationships, and I think it's something that most people have to confront at some point in their life. That's why when I read it now and hear me through this one, I think Lisa was the person that Scott should have ended up with. I know, I'm probably in the minority here, but Ramona was not a good girlfriend. There were tons of occasions where she didn't care about Scott, she didn't care about his well-being, and she even got off with Roxanne, who was one of the evil exes, while she'd kicked Scott out. So for me, I think he was making the same mistakes that he'd made when he was originally trying to go out with Envy. So if anything, that's probably why he should have ended up with Envy more so than Ramona, because at least Envy had developed a little bit by the end and she seemed to regret some of the actions that she'd taken, whereas you never really got that from Ramona. And like I said, I feel like Scott only wanted to go out with Ramona because of the effort that he'd already put in, rather than the fact that she is the best girl for him to go out with. Scott ending up knives wouldn't have felt right to me, because he'd made such a point of focusing on how immature and young she was that I feel like she has to go through some development. Obviously the character that she was by the end wasn't the one that she started out at, but I think she has to go on her own relationship journey. So obviously she's had her Scott, which is pretty much her Envy. She's got to find her equivalent of Lisa and Kim, her own knives and her own Ramona. With Kim, too much time had passed and it's clear that there's still some bitter resentment from her part that meant that they wouldn't be the right couple for each other. This time round though, even though we only got a short period of time with her, Lisa seemed to be what Kim could have been if they'd grown in the time since they'd finished high school. They'd both gone about their own lives and they both tried to achieve different things, but they still had some clear kind of connection with each other. And the story seems to be really about personal development and realising that who you are as a child doesn't really define who you are as an adult. So I think him ending up with Lisa, even though it might not have felt as earned as some of the other people that are on the list because of the fact that she was only really in one book, I think that would have made the most sense for the message that they were trying to bring across. But that's just my point of view, and admittedly I just thought that she was more likeable than Ramona. And I think as I'm wrapping this spoiler talk up, I think that's the reason why the ending didn't work too well for me, because of the fact that I didn't really have that massive vested interest in Scott ending up with Ramona. Sure, you did have great little moments where he was getting some closure with Envy and he was giving closure to Knives, and those scenes were great at completing those story arcs, but the friends that he'd gathered along the way and that he'd had throughout his life just seemed to fall into the background. Those were the people that had supported him throughout the course of this story, no matter if his decision was something that they agreed with or not. And yes, I get that that was part of the story, that you do end up growing away from your friends as you get older and the people that you don't see as often, even if before you saw them absolutely every day, which is something that hits harder now than when I first read it, but at the same time, they were all at the Chaos Theatre, so give us some more time with them. This is my final verdict, and to summarise it, Scott Pilgrim is a one-of-a-kind story. I also think it's got an integral role that it played in manga becoming more popular over here. So whether you're a comic person or a manga person or something in the middle, there is something in Scott Pilgrim for you. But more than your preference on which medium you prefer, I think the age that you're at and the place that you're at in your life when you read this is what's really important. When I was younger, this was a cool action book where the relationships were just there to set up the fights that were the bit that I really enjoyed, and it had a great sense of humour that for some reason I haven't really touched on in this review, but trust me, it is there. There's bits where you will laugh out loud throughout this book. It's got such a quick wit that sometimes it's hard to keep up with, but at the same time it never really falls flat on its face, but still that sense of humour is still there. But when you're reading it the first time, that's really what you take away from this book, just how goofy it is. Whereas now when I read it, the fights and that quirky sense of humour are an extra to the amazing relationship building that goes on throughout these 6 books. Although the quirky style and format and even the sense of humour may not stick the landing for everybody, I think the lessons that we can learn from reading this book are the real big takeaway from it. Everything else pretty much works as a smokescreen to get you into this book that really takes you on a journey with these characters as they're learning who they are and they become more human as the story goes on. Sure, yes, it has this video game style that nobody really has in the day-to-day life, but the fact of the matter is that the troubles and the lessons that they learn as the book goes on is something that we're all going to experience at some point in our lives. There is not one character in this book who is perfect, and they learn that as the story goes on, and that was the most interesting aspect as I go through this retrospective read, now that I'm older, now that I'm a bit more mature, and now that the book isn't coming out in a year-to-year basis. Yes, there are some references that may go over people's heads, and maybe it isn't as addictive as when it was first coming out, but how this works as a mirror to your own lives is worth it to read no matter how old you are. Through Scott, Ramona, Knives, and everyone else in it, you can judge your own decisions on how you've handled situations like that in the past, and there is guaranteed to be at least one that you've experienced in your own life. As far as coming of age stories go, I don't think there's going to be much better than Scott Pilgrim if it is that you also want to be entertained at the same time. So for that reason alone, it's going to get 4 out of 5 woofs. Woof, 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 woof. So that's my review of Scott Pilgrim. It's been a little bit different because of the fact that I'm changing up the format and I'm trying not to be as scripted so that hopefully more genuine emotion can come out through what I'm saying. Let me know in the comments section below if you prefer this format of doing it or if you prefer if I go back to the scripted way. I'd like to know what you guys thought of Scott Pilgrim and when was the last time that you read it. Leave it in the comments section below and we can discuss it further there. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this video, why did you get this far? If you're new here, make sure you click that subscribe button and get your paws all over that bell notification so that you can become part of the dog pound and make sure that you never miss out on a video. Check out my social media links that are in the description as well, because I always make sure that I put up as much comic content and news that I can. And we've also got our own Reddit page, r/MadDogComic Community, and I've got Amazon affiliate links down below. But another way that you can help the channel if you want to help your boy out is to make sure that you share this in any groups or on any Reddit or on your Facebook, your Instagram or your Twitter. But I've got my haul coming out soon and my next review is going to be Punisher by Garth Ennis, so make sure you're looking forward to that one. But until then, just make sure that you stay safe, stay reading the best books that you can find, and stay mad all you dogs. Woof woof! See you in the next video.